welcome to Full Crew, episode 83. We are talking about security today. I am your host, Bronwyn Morgan. I am an Autonomy Global Ambassador for Training and Education. We have some amazing guests with us today. We have Angelissa Savino of Savino Skies Consulting, also Brandon Youngblood of ZBeta Technologies, as well as Dr. Trent Teyama of the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies. So let's take this time to, first of all, acknowledge and thank our sponsors, always powered by LiveU. In addition to them, we also have Airspace Link as well as Viasat. So now let's get into our articles. We're going to talk about security today from various and different perspectives, specifically around counter UAS and how we're addressing that. But before we do that, let's give each of our guests a chance to introduce themselves. And I'm just going to start first with Dr. Trent.
Well, hey, thank you for having me today. Hi, glad to be here, Trent Teyama. So I'm the executive director of the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies. What is that? That's all the state bureaus of investigations it's the equivalent of like the FBI on the state level, but depending on which state you're in, it may be part of the state police or it may be its own agency. And what's really interesting, we've been focusing, especially coming off of FIFA, it's these agencies that have the responsibility for all the UAS and counter UAS, and we're just rolling off of lessons learned. We're putting together after action. Personally, retired from the FBI, one of the plank holders for the FBI for cyber investigations, cybersecurity, doing that, posted all over the country. A couple of tours at the White House, National Security Council for cyber. And so today I'm talking about how that overlaps where we're going and future looking relating to UAS, counter UAS, and space.
Thank you very much. This is going to be an interesting discussion. Also next is Brandon.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. So Brandon Youngblood, I've been in the drone world my entire professional career, so coming up on 24 years now. Most of that time was spent on the military side of the house. And then I was at the Pentagon when ISIS dropped a little handheld grenade off of a Phantom 4 in Mosul, or a Phantom 3 maybe. And seeing the intel reports come across the classified network, I decided I needed to get into the fight. And so I did everything I could to get onto the counter UAS mission with JIATO at the time, which was the counter IED office that still existed. And then I was there for about 9 months-ish. And then I got headhunted into the Federal Aviation Administration. And then I stood up the UAS security and counter UAS coordination office within the FAA. Stayed there for 5 years, where I worked closely with Angie and the Department of Justice side. And then I went independent consulting, and then I got picked up by a physical security consulting firm. So now I build counter UAS programs for critical infrastructure operators and more focus on the domestic security side of things. So thank you again for having me.
Very interesting. Well, it sounds like you know our next guest. Angelissa, tell us a little bit more about you.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you for having me. My name is Angie Savino, founder and managing attorney of Savino Skies Consulting. I was previously Marine Corps judge advocate, prosecutor, and then did policy work at the Pentagon, and then got my dream job at the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. The fact that was my dream job tells you how much of a nerd I am. I got to work on intelligence, cyber operations, and then moved over to the counter UAS portfolio, where I represented the justice's interests through the interagency process. Went head to head with Brandon a lot on what right looked like, and worked on the legislation that ultimately became the Safer Skies Act. Also worked closely with our agencies on their actual operations they were running, counter UAS operations they were running, and helped one or two of the agencies get their programs either stood up or almost to the point where they were stood up. So very excited to be here today and talk through the article that I had chosen about the new authorities that now SLPTs have across the country. Thank you.
Wow, this is going to be a quite spirited discussion, seeing as that you two specifically have a past together in this space. With that, Angie, I'm going to start with you. let's talk a little bit about your article, which explains really how the DOJ and the DHS, the interim final rule, implements the Safer Skies Act, giving state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement agencies a structured path on how to use counter UAS technology. Can you take us through this?
Yes, thank you. So I chose this article because it is a huge watershed, or it's highlighting a watershed change in the United States on who has the authority to use counter UAS technology. So in many instances, law enforcement can use technology for various reasons until a law says they can't use it, or there are some restrictions around what that technology is. When it comes to counter UAS technology, there's actually already a list of federal laws that anytime you turned on counter UAS technology, it could implicate those laws. So in order for law enforcement to use that technology, they had to have some permission from the federal government to say, you can turn on this technology and we won't prosecute you for these number of laws. So that is where we got the idea of 6 USC 124N, which was passed in 2018. And what it did, it was told the federal government, you can use this technology. And even though it technically violates these other laws, Congress passed the 2018 law to say you can still do it. So it's called a notwithstanding statute. So usually you hear people talk about how 124N, it authorizes, and in many ways, like practically it does, but it's actually just saying we're not going to prosecute you for these federal crimes that are otherwise implicated by these technologies. So that's the nerdy legal part. Basically, what happened was we've been operating in a space in the United States where only federal agencies, DHS, DOJ, DOD, and DOE have been able to use these counter UAS technologies legally. And there was a tight framework under which they did so, which involved extremely complicated packages and approval processes that Brandon and I used to work through to help protect big events that the FBI and DHS were able to cover. For years, everyone across the country in the law enforcement and national security space recognized that the FBI was only able to protect about 5 or 6% of all requests from states across the country to protect their events from nefarious or careless and clueless drone operators. So there was many efforts to create new legislation that would allow state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement agencies and correctional agencies to be able to use this technology. And in December of 2025, Congress finally passed the Safer Skies Act, which did exactly that. It said there's this new authority for I'll say SLTTs to be able to use this technology, but you have to follow certain rules. And the FBI and DHS, particularly DOJ and DHS, actually got pretty close to complying with the deadline to publish those rules. And on July 1st, they published a very lengthy document that established all the rules that SLTTs and correctional agencies have to follow if they want to use certain counter UAS technology. So the rule breaks down a full framework for state and local law enforcement agencies. Anyone who's watching this podcast is probably generally familiar with it. So I'll just hit wave tops. It breaks authorization. And again, I'm using authorization as a layman's term, not a legal term, as I previously mentioned. But it breaks authorization down into detection and warrant operations and then mitigation operations. And the intent, as they state in the rule, is that SLTTs across the country and correctional agencies can very quickly get their detection programs up and running. If individual or agencies have technology already, the IFR references it may only take 2 weeks to actually comply with the 90-minute training requirement, self-certification. Then they can turn their equipment on and they must follow the rules, but the only consequences would come about through auditing through the federal government. So the federal government is not approving their process. They are just coming back through an audit process. For mitigation, there's a lot more safety and security issues at play. So they made it much more difficult for agencies to be able to conduct mitigation operations, but they still have a pathway for it. So the biggest factor right now that's slowing the process down is there's a requirement that anyone who conducts mitigation activities goes to a FBI National Schoolhouse to receive training from the FBI. That is a thing that is not new. There was a feasibility study that was released a few years ago that detailed how this would happen. However, there's a huge bottleneck there. So I think they only project to be able to train 150 folks in the first 2 years, which is a slight problem because there's about 18,000 different SLTT agencies across the country. So it would take approximately 230 to 250 years to train everyone. And that is if there is no scaling up. So this is a very well-known problem. Federal government, quite frankly, is getting hammered by this right now. They're trying to figure out ways to move that process along. But the IFR details those requirements. So that's detection and mitigation. And then they also have requirements for what technology you can use. There has been a legal gray area about what technology implicates 124N and doesn't implicate 124N that industry partners are very well aware of. And it has caused a lot of confusion across the country. And so the IFR makes multiple comments that it is not saying that any previous operations were legal or illegal, but starting July 1st, when this interim final rule became effective, that these are now the rules that will govern this space. The comment period for public comment is 60 days. So September 4th is when comments are due. And I highly recommend if you deal with anything with counter UAS to consider providing comments. There's only been 8 comments submitted so far. There are many people who can help you work on those comments so that they're well informed and actionable for the FBI and DHS as they work to revise the rule. But we'll probably be stuck with this rule for about 5 to 10 years while we roll out counter UAS across the country. So it's really important we get this right and that it's not just the loudest voices that are heard, but also the voices of smaller jurisdictions as well. So that is the rundown. Why I think it's important. And I'm sure many of you, I'm curious to hear Trent and Brandon's thoughts on it as well.
Wow. Yeah, this is pretty big. And when I guess one of my primary questions is around this, not only just the training, 90 minutes is not a long time. And to get across, was it 18,000 unique agencies? How do we do that effectively? But when it comes to the equipment, will there be a preferred equipment list, do you think, that will be provided?
Thank you. Yes, so there is they broke out the equipment list into 2 tiers. So one, they have an authorized category list, and then within that, an authorized systems list. This is not required by the statute. This was a creative way to try to quickly populate the list. So right now, the only categories of technology approved are RF technology. And within that category, they populated, I believe it's 21 different systems by make, model, and hardware that are approved for use for SLTTs to use. And those are the only systems that are approved. The IFR states that they'll approve categories and that as they approve categories, individuals have to receive new training on each category, and then they'll slowly populate the systems for each category. However, and this is really in the weeds and kind of confusing, so I hope people comment on this, until they populate the authorized systems list with the make, model, hardware for any particular category, it's kind of a free-for-all. So you could risk purchasing equipment that ends up not on the authorized systems list, which would be a big problem. But yeah, thank you for that question. And that is especially for the industry who's producing all this equipment and looking to get it approved and pushed out. This could end up being, or I think it needs some refinement in order to not delay the rollout of this technology we really need desperately across the country and fast.
This will be a task. And I know in the past I've seen agencies that went out and bought a lot of drone equipment, and then when it came down to it, they were like, we overbought. We didn't need that. This is really not what we need. Now, what do we do with it? So this will be interesting. And my other question is, do we think that this role to manage this equipment will be left to the folks on these teams or these crews that are the Part 107 pilots, the drone pilots?
I think like who can actually operate the equipment, let's say in
Yes.
Kansas City, who can, yes. So the only folks who can hit the actual mitigation button are those who have received the training through the FBI
Mhm.
for the mitigation training.
Mhm.
And those are the only ones. Everyone can, if you have detection and warning training, you can operate under someone who's doing mitigation training. But at the end of the day, that one person who's been trained is the one that's allowed to hit that button to mitigate
Yeah.
a drone when necessary.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see also how budgets are, dispersed here to see if if there'll be money to help support these agencies in purchasing this equipment. Boy, this is a great article. Any other input from anybody else? Questions?
Well, on money, they dropped the White House task force on counter UAS was instrumental with getting a Safe Skies Act, but from 2025 dropped $250 million to the agency, specifically the 11 areas that were supporting FIFA. And then 2026 is dropping or should have dropped for another 250 million for the rest of the law enforcement agencies. Now, spread that out across all state, local, territorial, and tribal agencies, you can see that disappears pretty quickly. So, at least for the first and second tranche, it was greatly appreciated. And you could see how leaning forward for this area. But, buying the right stuff. I like the approach they did was very helpful that Angelissa mentioned, because now you're not necessarily buying the wrong stuff, which I know a lot of agencies pre-bought and are kind of stuck with gear they can't use now.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, with that, let's move on to Brandon's article, where you're talking about the evolution of counter UAS technology. I think, we're seeing a significant evolution from just standalone sensors to integrated software-driven defense systems. Tell us a little bit more about this, Brandon.
Yeah, so I wrote this up largely because of one of the programs I'm working on for a major energy supplier, to try and explain kind of not only how the evolution of counter UAS went, but where it's heading. Uh, as we know, watching Ukraine, the counter UAS technology that is fielded has really a shelf life of anywhere between 30 to 90 days, and they're already iterating past that. So the defense offense kind of back and forth technology development for warfare is just extraordinarily fast. And I mean, the historical examples of that all over the place. And so when counter UAS first started during the ISIS fight, again, it was more, what piece of gear, what equipment do I need to get into the field to stop these drones from doing whatever they're doing, whether it's dropping little grenade bomblets or surveillance or whatever the case may be. It was a single piece of equipment that went and did a thing. Maybe they incorporated a couple different types of technology, but largely it was one piece of gear. That very quickly showed that was ineffective. There's just too many technology and tactical ways to get around a lot of the single piece of equipment. And so what happened probably over the 5 years or so, the layered detection or the layered mitigation strategy came about, where they're layering RF, active radar, acoustics, EOIR sensors, and then layered mitigation strategies. So jamming, GPS jamming, kinetic drone interceptors, they call them LCEIs, or low collateral effects interceptors, etc. And so these technologies started layering on top of each other. What happened was, and this is where I might upset some people, apologize, sort of, maybe not, is the hardware integration is where the OEMs or the original equipment manufacturers really focused their attention. So they wanted to sell hardware. Well, to enable a layered detection or mitigation strategy, you have to have a top layer command and control to interact with all of those types of technology capabilities. So what the OEMs did was they built their own sustained command and control to function with their own, which we call sensor stacks or sensor towers or whatever you want to call them. So, for example, Anduril's got Lattice, Dedrone's got Drone Tracker AI. Every company now has their own type of command and control. The issue with that is most of it is IP protected. And so being able to integrate and share data among systems that may be from a different vendor became very, very difficult. The government really started forcing the hands of opening up some of their software capabilities to function interchangeably. So there are some strategic partnerships between different OEMs to enable some different types of integration, but largely it's still, if you own this sensor stack from this company, you get this C2 capability. And so we're really stuck now in between what I would say phase two, which is the sensor towers, and phase three, which is a complete open architecture command and control capability at the top layer that can integrate any type of hardware at the bottom layer, regardless of vendor. And so there are some companies out there, Unify C2, PicoGrid's doing it. I believe Airspace Link, the sponsor today, is working on some of this as well. To be that integration top layer capability so that you can take an Echo Dyn, you can take a Robin radar or a Matrix Space or Observation Without Limits radars, even though they don't have a strategic partnership with another vendor, they can still integrate with a DFEN, RF detection system or some other RF detection system. So it greatly enhances the capability, acquisition strategy, and procurement ability of the organization who needs to deploy these systems. Unfortunately, and this is maybe the controversial part, is, and I'm going to call them out because they already know, and I've done it a few times, JIATA 401 continues to march down this path of not really doing what they say they're supposed to be doing, which is providing an integration strategy of all capabilities rather than picking a specific prime vendor like Anduril, a $20 billion contract over 10 years. I mean, NASA is asking to go to the moon to set up a moon base for $20 billion. They're asking for the same, they issued that contract. And then they just announced a $500 million contract to CACI for their Corian system. So I have yet to see the government, at least, really grab onto a complete hardware agnostic command and control system that can integrate anything. And the advantages of doing such a thing is that it creates consistency and standardization at the user interface level, so that when I'm looking at my one screen, my one monitor as an operator, and many of these operators, they're 19, 20, 21-year-old kids.
Right.
And so when you flush out an entire new capability, they have to relearn this. How do I interact with this system? So if they had that hardware agnostic system, not only are you opening the aperture of what you can procure and integrate, but it's transparent to the operator who actually has to interact with those systems. And so creating that consistency through that command and control or common operating picture, if you will, is incredibly important. I'll use one example that Angie and I had to deal with a lot in the Washington, D.C., or the National Capital Region, the NCR, is you have every single federal government in this area, every single one of them. All of them have counter-UAS capabilities. None of them talk to each other. It's incredibly frustrating. And so you have the most protected piece of airspace on the face of the planet with billions of dollars of detection gear, and they don't share information between each other, largely because they are technically unable to do it because they all procure their own equipment that doesn't talk to each other. Now, people are going to come back and say, no, that's not true, and this and that. I'd love to have that conversation with them in person. Right. But that's the fact of the matter. And so we really need to take that step in the document that I wrote up, is moving from that second evolution phase into the third evolution phase by adopting an agnostic command and control system that everybody can play with. Unfortunately, it defeats the business model, which means there's lobbying going on, which means, it's very difficult to overcome.
Yeah, I would think so. Definitely. I mean, this interoperability is critical, and I know it's been a big focus of the drone industry, period. Yeah. Especially when it comes to public safety.
Yes. UTM, all that.
Yeah, all of that. And how will these things play in together with a UTM system? Do you have an idea?
So Angie and I were just talking about, it really goes back to the IFR. and how they're defining certain legal terms, and please comment on that. One of them is the communication, how the government defines communication data. And so the IFR unfortunately may inhibit UTM in certain ways because it really restricts the ability to share data, collect data. Well, let me reverse that. Collect data, then share it with applicable people. And
Mm.
so that's super important because UAS detection from the counter UAS side is really a dual purpose technology because it also enables deconfliction beyond visual line of sight operations and all that, because the same technology is really being used for both purposes. And so if they lump those together, even though they're not meaning to, they inadvertently are, and it can negatively impact if those legal definitions aren't modified and tweaked. I mean, like just a little bit, a few words here and there would greatly enhance that dual use capability.
Absolutely, absolutely. And before I open the conversation up, one other thing that I'm very curious about is, and in this article, goes into some depth about, most likely the increasing use of artificial intelligence and automation, predictive analytics,
Yeah.
within this technology. That sounds pretty scary. And not we're not really sure where that's going to go. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I'm really curious to hear Trent's opinion on this, having just come out of FIFA. 700 plus confiscations. I would times that by 3 detections. Um, how many of those were actually somebody with criminal intent? That the key word there is intent. And so we have a compliance issue in this country. People don't check NOTAMs, they don't check airspace largely. I mean, the compliant operators do. Thank you for doing what you do. But there are lots who don't. I mean, my dad is a perfect example. He was in a fishing tournament and he's like, I'm going to go buy a drone and dive bomb other fishermen to catch them off guard. I'm like, please don't do that.
Don't do that. Exactly.
and and so with the detection piece, this is where I think AI enabled and machine learning analytics behind trying to assess intent is very important, right? So if you have a drone that's kind of hovering outside of a major substation, that's suspicious and questionable, right? But if it's flying around and there's a field out there, a farm field, maybe it's doing agriculture spraying, and that AI can be trained to recognize certain behaviors to give a confidence score on potential criminal intent. And so that's where I think it can be used really, really well is threat characterization, criminal intent, and because at the end of the day, law enforcement has very limited resources to respond to a lot of these incidents and these detections. They have ground intercept teams, they have mitigation capabilities. And anytime you mitigate, you add risk into the national airspace system. And so anytime you can reduce the responsibility onto someone else by characterizing a detected drone as not a threat or more than likely not a threat, it readjusts those resources to respond to things that they maybe need to be responding to, right? And so there's
Right.
only a finite amount of law enforcement professionals that are out there, so they need to have as much time available as they can to respond to the things that they need to.
Right. I mean, it goes back to this comment that you were making about interoperability and the OEMs having a standard. And it
Yeah,
sounds like there'll have to be a standard created when it comes to the algorithms and the machine learning so that there's some consistency in recognizing what behaviors and or types of drones and
sure.
its proximity to critical infrastructure and or other important sites and how that's all measured and valued. Because if
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
you got one system that sees something as a threat and another one that doesn't. So that'll
Mhm.
be really interesting to get that granular in how to address just even the data design
Yeah,
in the machine learning system.
yeah. And I'm not a software engineer, so it's really easy for me to say, yeah, just go do this. Make the AI do that thing, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's not even really possible to get to that level of sophistication. I just don't know. And Trent, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well,
So
yeah, I think you can do it in the sense that I see least drone usage probably getting more and more regulated and reduced, and that people that are using it, I see where you're gonna have to file flight plans. You're what you're using it for. You're registering it. You're having transponder, and that's where the machine learning and AI would come in, because all of a sudden it pops up, and you can see it. And this is agricultural. I'm flying over my farms. I'm using these types, so you know what's in the area. Versus a lot of the FIFA thing, to what Brandon you asked about, was from what I heard from the different states and talking from our working group on it, was somebody that was just trying to get a better view, unrelated to the game. Actually, you had plenty that were trying to get into the game, but they were just doing real estate or something innocuous, but they're still in a restricted flight area. I do see a lot more fines. It's just the risk versus the hobby. It's not the RC controlled airplanes anymore, where you go out to the high school and just fly it around, increasing. Because here's the other thing is, like, on the state and local, a lot more involvement by our state and local law enforcement, because they're the first ones on the ground. So even if the FAA tower sees it, um, DHS, FBI is not rolling out to respond to it. It's going to be, the officer, the sheriff, the trooper, and then what are you doing? What's the intent? Yeah, I mean, and then trying to do it. I think a lot more is going to go for. It's really going to be in that registration, flight plans, and then who's operating. Because then you have all the 3D printed drones. You have the dark drones. Now you have, at least if it's not showing up, at least I'm going to defer as law enforcement. There's a problem, and then you got to work back. But go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, you touched on something I just want to chat about just real fast. And that's law enforcement's response capabilities and resource allocation, right? Law enforcement is already tapped out, period, dot.
Yeah.
I don't care where you go in the United States, they're limited on resources, they're working overtime. There's no way they're going to be able to respond. Well, let me back up. There's no way they're going to be able to prevent a drone attack. It's just not going to happen. They don't have the resource. They're not guards. They're not security guards and perimeter protection 24/7. And so when we're talking critical infrastructure, massive substations where you have power that are running through these substations, and if that substation gets attacked and they take out, let's say, 4 transformers in a sea of 20, that could potentially create a cascading effect where it burns out other subsequent transformers, and now you have a rolling blackout that could take a long time to fix. And I don't mean to be fear mongering and fear, uncertainty, doubt, FUD, whatever,
Yeah.
but or FUD. But the potential exists. We're seeing it every day in Ukraine. And so for me, I've been really trying to support Senator Cotton's bill, S-4380. Did I get that right, Angie? And then there's another one, House Resolution 9232, which provides critical infrastructure operators, airport authority police to protect airports. I mean, there was just a drone found with explosives attached to it in Germany on an airport, and they just happened to come across it. They didn't detect it. They found it on the ground. So, while Safer Skies Act is a great step forward, fantastic, we still have more work to do.
Yeah. I don't think you're fear mongering at all. I think these are the kinds of things that have to be discussed now, as we think through all the potential issues that can, that will be made, that will actually manifest if we don't think about them in advance. So I think you're spot on, and that really does bleed into Dr. Trent's article on cybersecurity. And this is, the subject is near and dear to my heart when it comes to autonomy and aerial, new aerial systems. And so when we think about this extending beyond just now the hardware itself, talk to us about this particular paper that you have identified.
Well, actually, so the paper's a 4-year research project. It was my dissertation that I did on, basically, it's called Forecasting the Final Frontier, Exploratory Research on Cybersecurity and Governance focus on commercial and private space operations. Now, but where it got into it over the 4-year research is we went from all the way from very, very low Earth orbit, so drone operations, all the way up to cislunar. And the way we're changing, because we're in the next space race right now. A lot of people going, okay, drone, UAS, counter use, what does it have to do with space? Well, kind of everything, because really what we're seeing in our airspace from terrestrial up to orbit is what we're dealing with, and we're going to start dealing, because command and control, it's using satellites. It's not just using cell towers or RF frequencies, and so you have to start thinking about it in a broader context. The 4-year research was focusing on what does that mean. So you have endpoints, or you have edge devices. You have their command and control. So you have the device, the asset, you have the command and control, the ground station, and then usually back to some other infrastructure. And how are you securing that? And really, what does that mean? So, like, this really kind of follows off what Brenda did, is like now we have an interoperability between our command and control structures that are going to the assets of the drones. Well, what's the cybersecurity and what are the controls that are built into it? And that's what I took a look at. And that's where, as my research expanded, which I thought it was going to be very niche, okay, hey, space, that's what we're doing, it's expanding. And we're right on the tipping point. So here's the thing with tipping point, the space discussion is no longer, it really comes down to two concepts: old space and new space. Old space, that was walking on the moon. That's the Russians. That's Sputnik. That's China. That's US. We're going in. It's the International Space Station. New space, over the last few years, we pivoted from, it's not just NASA anymore. It's now, you've got Blue Origin, you've got SpaceX. SpaceX did, I think, 353 launches in 2025. They did it over 80, 90% of launches and really dropped the cost. We're seeing more and more of it. So the reason why is that it's that tipping to commercial and private, which is getting ahead. So how does this deal with UAS and counter UAS? Well, it really does. How do we control it? How are you flying it? Because all of the large drones are really kind of being controlled by satellites. You have the smaller ones that are on the ground, they're either by fiber, tethered, maybe RF, maybe cellular, or maybe autonomous, getting into AI, where you're going into a denied environment. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with, both good and bad. But the question is how are we securing it? What are the threats? What are the vulnerabilities? And the rush forward is like, we're trying to do it. Okay, but in order to deny an airspace, we were talking about this, is like the different systems. One of the challenges we saw, especially from, on the state and local side, is we have all these different systems. They don't necessarily work together, and they don't necessarily do the same thing. And they're really designed to go over after a certain type of drone. Otherwise, it may have no effect. You finally get to that one guy that's on your team that can pull the trigger to interdict it. And what happened?
Right.
Did it work? Did it not work? And those are the challenges. But now you're related. See, you've got, okay, so the other thing to keep in mind is you got the mobile drone introduction, right? Sensors, and the static. And we're going to, like Brandon, how do we interconnect it? How do we track it? But how do you trust it? So a lot of my research, and if you want to read it, it's 396 pages. There's shorter articles that are coming out that you can read. However, it was vetted because I went to the top experts in the world on this, from cybersecurity, from governance, and from space. I mean, literally like top minds. And we spent that time going through it, like, what are the vulnerabilities? And these are the challenges that I would put to all the top, Anduril, Dedrone, all that. Are you building in the security from the hardware level? Besides supply chain, it's hardware assurance, so that I'm flying, and if there's a backdoor hard coded into that drone, well, I can just, now I can hack the drone, or that I'm going to try and intercept and take over the guys controlling it. If I can, electronic warfare, if I can intercept it and overpower it to take control. What are these controls going in? And that's why a lot of the tethered drones, especially we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine going back and forth, and the miles of, the drone fiber, is to prevent that. But, so that was a whole thing in my study. And the idea was coming out with actionable attention. Is mainly focused originally from low Earth to geospatial, all the way to lunar onto Mars. But what we found out, it started getting down into, okay, first the big drones, and then the overlap with what we're talking about day to day. What are we doing from agriculture? And the one thing we mentioned to really kind of put it in perspective from the state and local point of view, correctional institutions across this country, just here in the United States, now worldwide, are getting hammered with drone attacks. I mean, I had, first, academically and then professionally, I'm like, oh, I sat down with them. They're going, no, this happened last week. And they're laying out, where it's like Uber Eats. They're flying them right out. Everybody thinks, the prison, it's this big, USP, United States Penitentiary, the windows don't open. Most correctional facilities across our jails or penitentiaries are built in the 18 something. The windows open, drones are flying right up, bringing stuff in, and the correctional are trying. How do you deal with that? So a lot of them have the static, interception devices to detect and then intercept, but they're not quite working. So again, to Brandon's point, like how do we do it together? And then what is it actually called detection? So going over to DOJ and to Angelissa's point is tweaking that is like, okay, are we really trying to protect expectation of privacy? It surprised me. There's a thing called 2703D order, and the fact that before the legislation that just to collect that information, you may need orders in order to make it happen, which is kind of crazy because of what we're doing dynamically. But yeah, anyway, so this is what the research is. It's really exciting because, like I said, I thought it was going to be great. You do your dissertation, go for your doctorate, and it's very niche. It's wide open, and and bring up another area really quickly. And so you got threats, cybersecurity frameworks, the legal, jurisdictional, and policy issues, economic and geopolitical factors. Now that we're dealing on, and then finally technological development. So forensics alone, it's an entire other. So now I've captured it. We disrupted it. It dropped. Now what do I do? So traditional digital forensics. And then I'm a post-blast investigator for the FBI. So you have a large vehicle device, you have an IED, you do that, you go down range, we collect it. It's the same thing that I'm sure we're going to see with the adversarial, the UAS, is because they're going to be custom built. You actually do collect it. How do you collect it? And then how do you forensically examine it so you can trace it back versus, okay, I shot one down. I mean, it might be cool. You have the patrol cars with little drones painted on it, but I mean, it's all these questions and it's wide open. And so it's really exciting. So there's a lot there. Again, 396 pages. Don loved it. She read every page. So
yeah. Well, let me ask you this, because this, this is a very complex. There are a lot of, there are a lot of different elements here that have to be managed and considered. How long do you think it's going to take us to really get to a system that is effective, at least to even test it, to say this is something that we can start off as our phase one, application?
I think we're doing it right now, but we're not doing it fast enough. And it's a big thing at the top of the hour. Besides just training, there's a big difference from the operator that actually has to pull the trigger, is going to go down to Redstone at Huntsville, Alabama, go through the schoolhouse for National Counter UAS Training Center, and CUTSI, and go through that class. The same thing that the FBI does, same program they do for the bomb techs. It needs to expand, but a lot more training. And, we're focusing on the counter UAS. But UAS is being used right now, like really well. So this is the response thing going into. So I was talking to the chief of police in Beverly Hills, California. Beverly Hills, California has a very advanced, forward-leaning UAS program. They'll have a drone on seat, within seconds, 30 seconds to a minute of a 911 call. So you can actually assess what's going on. So there's all that, the goodness coming out of it. But now is that a police drone? Or is that somebody else's drone? Who's in my airspace? Who's hovering over my pool? Who's over my crop? What are we going to do about it? Hopefully it's FIFA did a lot, I think, getting ready for it to give the attention that really pushed the ball. We need to keep going. I think, for the industry that's manufacturing it, it'd be in their best interest to start thinking about how do I develop and integrate cybersecurity and those controls now, because really they don't want to get to the point where it comes later on that it's going to be a regulation or legislation. because that just mean their equipment's no longer going to be able to be used. It's just dead. So
Yeah.
those are the concepts we need now.
Angie, were you about to
Yeah,
react
just
to that?
two things. One is this concern with the cybersecurity of the C2 or the software. That was actually something that was mentioned in the IFR, and the IFR allows for a provision so that if there is an unintended consequence, so think you go to hit mitigate a drone, go back home, it shoots up 2,000 feet, not like that's ever happened. Those have to be immediately reported, and then the federal government can immediately require all SLTTs to stop using that equipment. So they're really putting this huge onus on the industry to make sure that their equipment is cyber secure, because otherwise it could literally require, eventually the 18,000 SLTT agencies who even just have detection equipment to immediately cease operations until they can figure out what happened. So I think the cybersecurity one, I really appreciate the research that you did and are doing. And it's something that we're probably going to see more. Some of our very sophisticated cyber systems are being attacked. And so this is likely going to happen. And the FBI foresaw that in the IFR. And then the second piece is
Hey,
historically.
Angie. Yeah, can I just peel that a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So I want to hit on something that Angie said, because this actually happened operationally in Oregon. The drone, this was probably about 4 years ago. There was FBI team out doing their job. Great. They mitigated a drone, cut the link, but the drone was pre-programmed to climb. And the reason why is because most of these drones, and the one I operated in the military was no different, is when it cut the command link between the controller and the drone, what it thinks is, oh, I'm behind some kind of obstacle, I need to elevate to regain that command link. That drone climbed up to 2,500 feet, and that's prime helicopter, low altitude general aviation aircraft. So they were in this quandary now: who owns the drone? Is it the FBI that owns the drone because they're the one that sort of severed the command link? Is it the operator that owns the drone who was flying it, but they didn't? So, and this wasn't a cybersecurity issue. It was just the mechanics of how the mitigation equipment worked with the behavior of the drone when it lost that command link. And so what on the FAA side, what we tried to emphasize is that it doesn't matter if you're NYPD, LAPD, name a big city, Chicago, or out in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. If you create a safety hazard, you're going to shut the entire thing down nationally, because people are not comfortable with the technology yet, both counter and drones, and both of those together. And so that's why I believe they put, and Angie, correct me if I'm wrong, why they put that provision in the IFR is it's kind of like an aircraft fleet. If a 737 has an incident, and it's a technical issue, they could ground that entire fleet, and then the economic impact and all that other stuff. And so if we have an incident where the operator may do something weird with a technology, you're grounding nationally, and then we're vulnerable again, right? So it's something I wanted to pull apart. Sorry, Angie.
Yeah.
That's okay. The other piece that ties right into that, Brandon, is that historically only the federal government could prosecute these counter UAS or these drone violations. They were federal TFRs, so AUSAs had to come in and prosecute. Historically, they were just misdemeanors. The Safer Skies Act has a pathway for repeat and more serious offenses having more serious penalties associated. So we'll start to see federal prosecutors most likely as they get educated, which is going to take a huge effort, is to get all our AUSAs up to speed on how to prosecute these crimes and then explain to judges what they're trying to prosecute. But now SLTTs can start the process of being able to prosecute drone offenses across the country. And this is huge because the technology, a lot of it has never gone through a suppression motion. So defense counsel, let's say an SLTT takes down a drone using a certain type of technology. If that SLTT says this is not 124N technology, we did it, it doesn't implicate the laws, that's great. But a smart defense counsel is very quickly going to tear that apart and do a suppression motion on multiple grounds to try to say you actually never should have detected that drone in the first place. And this is why it violates the pen trap statute, the wiretap, so on and so forth. So I think, and I'm for the good of the country and for clarity, I do hope a lot of these cases get litigated and litigated well, so we can get some case law, so we have clarity across the country about what can be used and not be used, and what technology is governed by the new data definitions in the IFR, and which technology is not governed by the new definitions in the IFR. Because as prosecutions start picking up, we are going to have a more well-developed understanding of how the technology works and how the judiciary system is interpreting the way those laws work as well. I'm Trent. I would love to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. Because the it's where it's the same challenge where technology is in reality is outpacing what the original intent of pen trap and trace, and wiretap covers. Which it kind of blows my mind that, hey, I might need to go wiretap to do this, which is very, very onerous. So people don't understand, for me to do a wiretap in the FBI, that, and over here, the traditional, hey, we put the headphones on and we, going all the way back to the gangster days, and more digital ones today, it still has to go all the way up to the Attorney General. So it's not like something is a quick, it's the field office, the U.S. Attorney's office, all the way up to main justice, back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. But only through that process to get the authorization to do that intercept. Now, do that in a dynamic, responsive way that something happened now. I mean, yeah, we need to clarify that. There's a lot, because I see a lot more of the hobbyists dropping just out of reality, and then it becoming more like general aviation, in that spot. I think Brandon might like that from the FAA, but just what's out there versus just a fun. It's a fun FPV that I'm shooting, flying through hoops in a hangar somewhere for competition. But yeah, we need to do it much easier, especially on the state side, because really the feds, God bless them, can't get there fast enough, and there aren't enough of them. And there's everything else going on, and even with the first responders, I mean, there's only so many of them too. So yeah, it's hopefully a crisis won't have to happen to force things to change.
This is why this is going to take time, and our testing, the testing framework for this is going to be critical, so that we can ensure that the system, at least as it's originally designed, is effective. But there will be some trial and error in this that is quite concerning. Angie, what were you going to say?
I just want to add one quick plug for any of maybe Trent's audience or anyone else, is that states also should be thinking about ways to enable prosecutors to prosecute these offenses as well. So there's a whole state strategy and framework that needs to be implemented by states on how they govern UAS and counter UAS use for good and bad, and technology for good and bad as well.
Okay. Well, listen, we are out of time. This has been an amazing show. I know this can go on for, half a day easily, if not more. But before we go, I want to just take a chance again to thank all of our sponsors, always powered by LiveU, Airspace Link, and Viasat. And also want to thank our guests. You all have been amazing, Angie, Brandon, and Dr. Trent. And also, before we go, please let us know where we can find you. Angie, where can we find you?
SavinoSkiesConsulting.com.
Okay. Can we find you also on social media?
Yes, LinkedIn. That's basically the only one I'm really on right now.
Understood. Brandon, where can we find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay. All right. And then also, Dr. Trent, where can we find you?
You can find me at ascia.org, ASCIA.org is our website. You also can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm Bronwyn Morgan. I'm your host. You can also find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at also airversity.com, AIRVERSITY.com, where we actually do professional drone pilot training and also drone services, and then ZOAir.com, XEOAIR AIR.com, where we are designing autonomous UAV systems. So I want to thank everybody again, and get prepared for next week's show, and follow Autonomy Global. Thank you again for joining Full Crew on this Tuesday.